The Institute for Gender, Sexuality and Feminist Studies is superb. This is just one of many great events that they've run this year. Please keep an eye on them in the future. They're really worth watching out for. First this afternoon is Dr. Sharon Cowan. Sharon is Senior Lecturer in Criminal Law and Medical Jurisprudence at the School of Law, University of Edinburgh. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sharon Cowan.
What my research does is tries to look in detail at transgender people's experiences of the impact of the law upon their lives in 3 jurisdictions, the UK, Canada and the US. And it's clear from all 3 of those jurisdictions that transgender people have struggled to gain legal rights and protections, notwithstanding long histories of civil rights and human rights jurisprudence in those jurisdictions. So what I'm aiming to do is understand trans people's everyday experiences, interactions around law, not only on the basis of gender, but also other markers and axes of identity, empowerment and oppression, as well as their perceptions of equality, social justice and regulation. The first theme of loss is one that came out across several of the interviews that I did. And I want to be careful to say here that I'm not implying that trans or transitioning across genders is marked only by loss. What really came across to me was that for my interviewees, living in the world that we live in, dominated by binary conceptions of sex, gender identity and sexual orientation, they often felt that they had to make a choice that involved some kind of loss, a giving up of status or group membership that would be incompatible with their gender identity. The question of poverty is one that is really, really important and has come out through my research as well, the intersections between poverty and transgender social conditions. And what was really interesting in my conversations with Wyatt was how he perceived how people saw him not just in gender terms but in class terms. So he said that he lost the attention of women except for mums and kind women, grannies. Most people look away because he doesn't clean up his beard, he looks poor, he looks homeless. Despite distrust of law, some of the people that I spoke to did actually say that they had some form of faith in law. So Sam, for example, said that although law was super limiting and that the possibilities of law were not endless, he said, I just want to remain queer and keep the law as queer as it can possibly be, if that makes sense. So there is still hope amongst the people that I spoke to that law is something they can turn to with companies of social justice. That's all I'm saying.
Dr. Roderick Ferguson is our next speaker. Roderick teaches in the Department of American Studies at the University of Minnesota. He's also affiliated with the Departments of Gender, Women and Sexuality Studies and African American and African Studies. Welcome back to McGill. Thank you.
Some of you who know my work know I have always tried to approach social movements as intellectual formations, and I want to extend that consideration to the question of how social movements and how rights right certain social movements and how they also unright certain social movements, okay? The gay rights movement, as Reddy and Spade suggest, relies on a certain telling of the civil rights movement. For example, as hate crimes legislation, like the Shepherd-Bird Act demonstrates, gay rights re-narrates struggles over sexuality by re-narrating struggles over race. Specifically, they do so by constructing the state as the domain of resolution and by promoting rights-based practices as the raison d'etre for political agency. In addition, by seeing rights as the end of politics, gay rights also erases the histories of how anti-racist and queer movements mobilized sexuality, gender, and race to challenge and move beyond the logics and practices of the state. The gay rights movement participates in a marginalization and polemicization in as much as it subjugates the history of how radical queer political formations were inspired by an ethos of radicalization, one that attempted to shape modes of difference like sexuality and gender in terms of that radicalization. Hence, by marginalizing the Black Power movement and fetishizing the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement subjugates our knowledge about insurgent feminist and queer movements as well. I'll end by saying that part of why the history of these movements matters is precisely because this is a history in which groups like Gay Liberation Front and Third World Gay Revolution insisted that sexuality and sexual freedom be part of conversations and projects that work to promote freedoms from state and military violence, economic deprivation, and prison expansion. Thanks.
Dean and Associate Professor at Seattle University School of Law. He teaches administrative law, poverty law, and law and social movements. Dean Spade.
So today I want to talk about how specifically the US and Israel, and I think we can talk about Canada in this one too, use their purported support for gay rights to hold themselves out as human rights protecting countries. Often with an assertion that they care about women or gay people, unlike Arab or Muslim countries or societies, right? So there's like real Islamophobic and war on terror supporting, occupation supporting framework that this is key to. I specifically want to talk about how the key evidence, like what this equality maps out as in this context, is literally just whether or not, in the case of the US, lesbian gay people, in the case of Israel, LGBT people can serve in the military, and whether or not they can marry. These two legal reforms are being articulated consistently in the US as left, as progressive, as tolerance policies, and there's this kind of appeal to straight people and to queer and trans people. I think it's important that it's really to straight people too, maybe intensely straight people, who've come to identify these reforms as synonymous with anti-homophobia. So, obviously this notion of these ideas around marriage and the military are highly contested by feminist, anti-colonial, and anti-racist movements. Who've argued in many different contexts and times that rather than the question being, can we get these gay rights, can we get into the US military and marriage, the question is really, how do we abolish the military and marriage? And rather, should we measure the US and Israel by whether or not they allow us access to these things? Instead, what are these things and what do they actually do in our societies? It's a complex moment in the queer and trans politics right now, because these two equality law reforms, marriage and the military, are lifted up as the most important or only queer political demands. And the pretense is that these demands have organically emerged, that these are things we all just want, when actually queer and trans people have been demanding real relief from conditions that we face, including demands to end criminalization, poverty, immigration enforcement, and occupation, right? So I'll just finish by saying that equality is a concept operating inside racist and settler colonial regimes like Canada, the US, and Israel to justify and expand their genocidal and racial projects. And anti-colonial and anti-racist movements have very different horizons for what we understand as liberation or change or transformation, which includes imagining things like prison abolition, an end to borders, an end to poverty, and decolonization, which is a big thing to try to imagine in settler colonial spaces. Decolonization is like, it really requires us to very actively be imagining these things together. People have lived under nation-state forms for an incredibly tiny amount of all human history. So when people tell us that it is unthinkable to imagine decolonization, I think that is a real failure of imagination that we can easily work together to kind of move through.